Everyone asks why the victim did not run, why they stayed, why they obeyed. This case answers that question in the most uncomfortable way possible. Because by the time the door was locked, the choice was already gone. The fear was trained. The resistance was erased. And what happened next was not sudden violence, but a slow, deliberate psychological takeover that most people would not survive. If you think you would have acted differently, listen carefully, because this story proves how easily the mind can be controlled without anyone noticing. On May 19, 1977, a young woman named Colleen Stan accepted a ride from what appeared to be a normal family traveling through Northern California. 7 years later, she would emerge from captivity, having spent most of that time locked inside a wooden box beneath a waterbed, her mind so thoroughly controlled that she never once attempted escape despite numerous opportunities. The question that haunts psychologists to this day is not how she was physically restrained, but how her captors managed to imprison her mind so completely that the locks became unnecessary. Before we continue, leave a comment below. What psychological technique do you think could make someone stay captive, even when the door is unlocked? Colleen Stan was 20 years old, hitchhiking from her home in Eugene, Oregon, to a birthday party in Northern California. She had turned down several rides that day, waiting for one that felt safe. When Cameron Hooker pulled over in a light blue Dodge van with his wife Janice and their infant daughter in the backseat, Colleen felt reassured. A family seemed trustworthy. She climbed into the vehicle and sealed her fate. Cameron Hooker had been planning this abduction for years. He had built the box. He had studied techniques of coercive control. He had conditioned his own wife into submission through a combination of religious manipulation and escalating violence. Janice Hooker had learned not to question, not to resist, not to think beyond the boundaries her husband established. She had become, in psychological terms, a secondary victim who would facilitate the primary crime. Within minutes of accepting the ride, Colleen found a knife pressed against her ribs. Cameron forced a homemade wooden head box over her skull, plunging her into darkness and sensory deprivation. He drove her to his mobile home in Red Bluff, where he hung her by her wrists from a beam in the ceiling. For the first several months, this would be her primary position. The pain in her shoulders became constant. Her world contracted to darkness, silence, and the periodic visits from her captor. What Cameron Hooker understood, whether through instinct or study, was that physical restraint alone would never be sufficient for long-term captivity. He needed to control Colleen's mind, to reshape her understanding of reality itself. He began implementing what psychologists would later recognize as a textbook case of coercive control, combining elements that would break down her sense of self and rebuild it according to his design. The first element was isolation. Colleen had no contact with the outside world. She could not see, could barely hear, and had no way to mark the passage of time. Days blended into weeks. Her previous life began to feel like a dream. The only consistent reality was Cameron's voice, Cameron's rules, Cameron's presence. The second element was dependence. Cameron controlled every aspect of Colleen's existence. When she ate, when she drank, when she was allowed to use the bathroom, when she could sleep. Her survival depended entirely on his decisions. Psychologically, this creates a trauma bond, where the victim begins to view their captor as the source of both suffering and relief, punishment and mercy. The third element was the systematic destruction of her identity. Cameron gave her a new name, Kay. He told her she was now the property of an organization called the Company, a powerful underground group that monitored her constantly through hidden cameras and microphones. If she tried to escape, the Company would kill her family. If she disobeyed, the Company would torture her in ways that made her current suffering seem mild. If she cooperated, she might eventually earn privileges. The Company did not exist. It was a complete fabrication. But Colleen had no way to verify this. Isolated, dependent, and subjected to unpredictable punishment, her mind accepted the narrative because rejecting it meant confronting a reality too terrifying to process. That she was completely alone, that no one was coming to save her, that her survival depended on a man who viewed her as property. Would you have believed in the Company? When your entire reality is controlled by one person, how do you distinguish truth from manipulation? After several months of hanging from the ceiling, Cameron moved Colleen into the box. He had constructed it from plywood, measuring roughly 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2 feet deep. It sat beneath the waterbed he shared with his wife. Colleen would spend up to 23 hours a day inside this box, lying in darkness, unable to stretch, unable to move, her muscles atrophying, her mind fragmenting. The psychological impact of such confinement is difficult for most people to comprehend. Sensory deprivation causes hallucinations. The absence of external stimuli forces the mind to generate its own input, often in disturbing ways. Time loses meaning. The self begins to dissolve. What remains is a consciousness trapped in an eternal present, where the only escape is dissociation. Colleen learned to leave her body. She would imagine herself elsewhere, construct elaborate mental worlds where she had agency and freedom. This dissociation was both a survival mechanism and a form of psychological surrender. She was adapting to captivity, and adaptation meant accepting that this was now her life. Cameron would periodically remove Colleen from the box for what he called training sessions. He would hang her from the ceiling again, whip her, subject her to sexual assault, and reinforce the rules of the company. He presented her with a contract, a multi-page document outlining her status as a slave and the consequences of disobedience. Colleen signed it. In her mind, she had no choice. The company was watching. Her family's lives depended on her compliance. What makes this case particularly disturbing is that Cameron eventually gave Colleen increasing freedom. He allowed her out of the box for longer periods. He permitted her to work in the yard, to help with household chores, to interact with neighbors. He even allowed her to visit her family, accompanied by Janice, with strict instructions about what she could and could not say. Colleen never tried to escape during these visits. She never told her family what was happening. She returned to Red Bluff, to the box, to her captivity. This is the aspect of the case that most people find incomprehensible. She had opportunities. She had moments when she could have run, could have screamed, could have asked for help. She chose not to. But choice implies agency, and agency is precisely what coercive control destroys. Colleen's mind had been so thoroughly conditioned that escape felt more dangerous than captivity. The company would kill her family. Cameron would find her. The punishment would be worse than anything she had already endured. These beliefs were not rational, but trauma does not operate according to rational principles. Psychologists call this learned helplessness, a condition first identified in laboratory experiments where animals subjected to inescapable punishment eventually stopped trying to escape even when escape became possible. The mind learns that resistance is futile, that action leads only to suffering, that survival depends on absolute submission. Colleen had learned this lesson thoroughly. Do you think you would have tried to escape? Or do you think the psychological conditioning would have been too powerful? The case finally broke open not because Colleen escaped, but because Janice Hooker's own psychological conditioning began to fracture. After 7 years of watching her husband torture another woman, after years of her own abuse, after the birth of additional children who were growing up in this environment, something in Janice's mind shifted. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was fear for her children. Perhaps it was simply that even the most thoroughly controlled mind eventually reaches a breaking point. In 1984, Janice told Colleen the truth. The company did not exist. There were no hidden cameras. No one was watching her family. Cameron had invented the entire organization to control her mind. This revelation should have been liberating, but for Colleen, it was devastating. Her entire reality had been constructed around the company's existence. Without it, she had to confront what had actually happened to her, and that confrontation was almost unbearable. Janice helped Colleen escape and eventually went to the police. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Cameron Hooker's crimes. Detectives found the box, the head restraint, the contract, the elaborate system of control he had constructed. They interviewed Colleen and documented 7 years of psychological torture that had left her alive but fundamentally altered. Cameron Hooker was arrested and charged with kidnapping and sexual assault. His trial became a landmark case in understanding coercive control. Psychologists testified about learned helplessness, about trauma bonding, about the ways prolonged captivity reshapes the mind. The prosecution had to explain to the jury why Colleen had not escaped when she had the chance, why she had signed the contract, why she had returned from visits to her family. The defense argued that Colleen had stayed willingly, that she had been a consensual participant in what they characterized as an alternative lifestyle. This argument reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of coercive control. Consent requires the ability to refuse, and Colleen had been systematically stripped of that ability. Her compliance was not consent, it was survival. Cameron Hooker was convicted and sentenced to 104 years in prison. Janice Hooker received immunity in exchange for her testimony, a decision that remains controversial. She was both a victim and a perpetrator, both controlled and complicit. The legal system struggled to categorize her role, just as it struggled to fully comprehend the psychological mechanisms that had kept Colleen captive. Colleen Stan survived, but survival is not the same as recovery. She has spoken publicly about her experience, working to help others understand coercive control and psychological captivity. She has described the ongoing process of reclaiming her mind, of learning to trust her own perceptions again, of rebuilding an identity that was systematically destroyed. The case of the girl in the box forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of captivity and freedom. We like to believe that physical restraints are what keep people imprisoned, that locked doors and chains are the mechanisms of captivity. But Cameron Hooker proved that the most effective prison is psychological. When you control someone's understanding of reality, when you make them believe that resistance is impossible and escape is fatal, you do not need locks. The mind becomes its own cage, and the victim becomes their own jailer. On March 24, 1987, Philadelphia police received a call about a woman running through the streets in nothing but a thin coat and chains still attached to her ankles. When officers found Josefina Rivera, she told them a story so disturbing that some initially doubted its veracity. She claimed she had been held captive in a basement for 4 months, that there were other women still imprisoned there, and that at least 2 had died. When police arrived at 3520 North Marshall Street, they discovered that every word was true, and that the reality was somehow worse than Josefina had described. Comment below, at what point does a person decide that other human beings are not human at all? Gary Heidnik was 43 years old, a former Army medic with a documented history of mental illness and a previous conviction for kidnapping. He lived alone in a 3-story house in North Philadelphia, a neighborhood where screams were common enough that neighbors had learned not to investigate. He had money, approximately $500,000 from investments and a disability settlement, which he used to fund what he called his vision, creating a baby farm where he would impregnate multiple women and raise a large family under his complete control. This was not a sudden impulse. Heidnik had been planning for years. He had reinforced the basement of his house, soundproofing it and installing chains and restraints. He had studied methods of control and punishment. He had convinced himself that what he was planning was not kidnapping or torture, but rather the establishment of a new kind of family structure where he would be the absolute authority. The first woman Heidnik abducted was Josefina Rivera, a sex worker he had been seeing regularly for several months. On November 26, 1986, he offered her money for sex, drove her to his house, and once inside, forced her into the basement at gunpoint. He chained her by the neck to a pipe and informed her of his plan. She would be the first of many. She would bear his children. She would never leave. What Josefina understood immediately was that survival would require cooperation. She could not overpower Heidnik physically. She could not escape while chained. Her only option was to make herself valuable, to position herself as an ally rather than a victim, to wait for an opportunity. This decision would save her life and haunt her conscience for years to come. Over the next several weeks, Heidnik abducted 4 more women: Sandra Lindsay, Lisa Thomas, Deborah Dudley, and Jacqueline Askins. All were black women, most were sex workers. All came from circumstances that made them vulnerable and less likely to be immediately missed. Heidnik had chosen his victims carefully, understanding that society's indifference to certain populations would buy him time. The basement became a chamber of systematic dehumanization. Heidnik kept the women chained, often naked, in conditions of deliberate squalor. He fed them sporadically and inadequately. He subjected them to sexual assault on a rotating basis. He played them against each other, rewarding compliance and punishing resistance, creating a hierarchy where cooperation with the captor became a survival strategy. This is a crucial psychological dynamic in cases of multiple captives. When resources are scarce and punishment is arbitrary, victims often turn on each other rather than uniting against their captor. Heidnik encouraged this. He gave Josefina small privileges in exchange for helping him control the others. He made her complicit in the captivity, binding her to him through shared guilt. Would you have cooperated to survive? Or would you have resisted knowing it might cost you your life? Sandra Lindsay was the first to die. She had been the most resistant, the least willing to submit to Heidnik's control. He punished her by hanging her from a beam by her wrists for days at a time. When she became ill, He ignored her deteriorating condition. When she died, likely from a combination of malnutrition, exposure, and the physical trauma of prolonged suspension, Heidnick's response revealed the depth of his psychological detachment from normal human empathy. He dismembered her body in the basement while the other women listened. He cooked parts of her remains and mixed them with dog food, which he then fed to the surviving captives. Whether they knew what they were eating remains unclear, but the psychological impact of this act was devastating regardless. Heidnick was not just torturing their bodies. He was destroying their sense of reality, their understanding of what was possible, their ability to maintain any psychological distance from the horror. This is torture at its most sophisticated. Physical pain is temporary. The body adapts, endures, heals. But forcing someone to participate in the desecration of another human being, to consume the remains of someone who died in the same chains they now wear, creates a psychological wound that never fully closes. Heidnick understood this, whether consciously or instinctively. He disposed of Sandra's remaining body parts in various locations around Philadelphia. Some he put in the basement freezer, some he ground up and scattered. He showed no remorse, no recognition that he had killed a human being. In his mind, she had failed to fulfill her purpose, and her death was simply a logistical problem to be solved. The other women now understood that resistance meant death. They became more compliant, more willing to follow Heidnick's rules, more desperate to avoid Sandra's fate. This was exactly the lesson Heidnick intended to teach. Fear is a powerful tool of control, but fear combined with the complete absence of hope is even more effective. Deborah Dudley would be the second to die. She had continued to resist despite Sandra's death, continued to argue and fight back. Heidnick decided to make an example of her. He took her and the other women to a park where he forced Deborah into a pit he had dug. He filled the pit with water, attached electrical wires to her chains, and electrocuted her while the others watched. This public execution served multiple purposes. It reinforced his absolute power. It demonstrated that death could come at any moment, in any place. It forced the surviving women to witness and therefore become complicit in Deborah's murder. Trauma bonds are strengthened when victims share experiences of extreme horror. Heidnick was not just controlling their bodies. He was reshaping their minds, creating a shared reality where he was God and they were nothing. After Deborah's death, Heidnick's behavior became increasingly erratic. He began punishing the women for minor infractions by forcing them into a pit he had dug in the basement floor, which he would then fill with water and electrify. He would leave them there for hours, the threat of electrocution constant, the cold water causing hypothermia, their minds fragmenting under the combination of physical suffering and psychological terror. Josefina Rivera had maintained her strategy of cooperation throughout these months. She had positioned herself as Heidnick's favorite, the one he trusted most. She had helped him control the others, had followed his rules, had done whatever was necessary to stay alive. Now she saw her opportunity. She convinced Heidnick that she could help him abduct more women. She argued that she knew the streets, knew which women would be suitable, knew how to gain their trust. Heidnick, believing he had successfully broken her will, agreed. He began taking her out of the house, allowing her limited freedom under his supervision. On March 24, 1987, Josefina convinced Heidnick to let her visit her family. She promised she would return. She had spent 4 months convincing him of her loyalty, 4 months playing the role of willing participant. He believed her. He let her go. She went directly to the police. The raid on 3520 North Marshall Street revealed conditions that shocked even experienced investigators. The basement was a scene of deliberate human degradation. 2 women were still chained there, malnourished and traumatized. The evidence of Sandra Lindsay's murder was scattered throughout the house. The pit where Deborah Dudley had been tortured was still filled with water. Gary Heidnick was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder, multiple counts of kidnapping, rape, and aggravated assault. His trial became an examination of the question that haunts all such cases. Was he insane, or was he simply evil? The defense argued that Heidnick suffered from severe mental illness, that his history of psychiatric hospitalizations and suicide attempts demonstrated a mind incapable of understanding right from wrong. The prosecution argued that his careful planning, his methodical approach to captivity, his ability to maintain a normal appearance to the outside world, all demonstrated that he knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. The jury sided with the prosecution. Heidnik was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death. He was executed by lethal injection on July 6, 1999. One of the last people executed in Pennsylvania before the state imposed a moratorium on capital punishment. But the legal resolution did not resolve the deeper questions the case raised. How does a person reach a point where they can torture and kill other human beings without apparent remorse? What combination of mental illness, personality disorder, and moral failure creates someone like Gary Heidnik? Psychologists who studied the case identified several factors. Heidnik had a history of childhood abuse and neglect. He had suffered head injuries that may have caused brain damage. He had documented mental illness, including schizophrenia. But millions of people experience abuse, head injuries, and mental illness without becoming torturers and murderers. Something else was required, some additional element that allowed him to view other people not as human beings, but as objects to be used and discarded. Some researchers point to his time in the military, where he was trained to dehumanize enemies. Others point to his failed relationships and his growing conviction that women had wronged him. Still, others argue that he was simply a sadist who found a way to rationalize his desires through the framework of creating a family. The truth is likely some combination of all these factors, but understanding the causes does not diminish the horror of the effects. 6 women were imprisoned in that basement. 2 died there. The 4 who survived carry psychological scars that will never fully heal. Josefina Rivera has spoken about her experience and the guilt she carries for cooperating with Heidnik, for helping him control the other women, for surviving when Sandra and Deborah did not. She has described the impossible choices captivity creates, the way survival sometimes requires actions that violate every moral principle you hold. She has worked to help people understand that victims of prolonged captivity cannot be judged by normal standards of behavior, that cooperation with a captor is not weakness or complicity, but rather a desperate strategy for staying alive. The case of Gary Heidnik demonstrates how captivity becomes a separate reality with its own rules and logic. Inside that basement, normal morality ceased to function. The only law was Heidnik's will. The only goal was survival. The women who endured those 4 months were forced to become people they never imagined they could be, to make choices they never imagined they would face, to live in a world where humanity itself became a luxury they could not afford. In October 1988, police in Kansas City received a call from a woman who claimed she had been held as a slave for nearly a year. When officers arrived at the address she provided, they found a scene that seemed impossible in modern America. A woman who had been systematically broken down through a combination of physical torture, psychological manipulation, and complete isolation until she believed she had no choice but to obey. The man responsible was not a stranger who had abducted her off the street. He was someone she had known, someone she had trusted, someone who had slowly and methodically transformed their relationship from consensual to captive. Before we continue, comment with your answer. How long do you think it would take to completely break someone's will? Edward Baker was a 41-year-old construction worker living in Kansas City. He had a history of failed relationships and a growing obsession with control and domination. He had studied techniques of coercive control, had read about historical cases of slavery and captivity, had developed a detailed understanding of how to break down a person's psychological resistance. He was not impulsive or disorganized. He was methodical, patient, and deeply committed to his vision of absolute power over another human being. His victim was a woman named Catherine, a 32-year-old single mother who had met Baker through mutual friends. Their relationship began normally enough. They dated. She introduced him to her children. He seemed stable, employed, reliable. She had no way of knowing that he was carefully studying her, identifying her vulnerabilities, planning how he would eventually trap her. The transformation from boyfriend to captor was gradual. Baker did not suddenly reveal his intentions. Instead, he slowly increased his control over Catherine's life. He convinced her to move in with him, arguing it would be better for her children. He encouraged her to quit her job, offering to support her financially. He isolated her from friends and family, creating conflicts and arguments that made her feel she had to choose between him and them. This gradual escalation is characteristic of coercive control. Abusers rarely reveal their true nature immediately. Instead, they create dependence first, then isolation, then fear. By the time the victim realizes what is happening, they are already trapped, already dependent, already cut off from support systems that might help them escape. Once Catherine was living in his house, unemployed and isolated, Baker began implementing more overt forms of control. He established rules about when she could eat, when she could sleep, when she could use the bathroom. He monitored her constantly. He punished violations with escalating severity, starting with verbal abuse, progressing to physical violence, eventually incorporating torture. He built a cage in the basement, a metal structure barely large enough for a person to crouch inside. When Catherine disobeyed or displeased him, he would lock her in this cage for hours or days at a time. The cage was not just physical confinement. It was a symbol of her status, a constant reminder that she was no longer a person but property. Baker began calling Catherine his slave. He forced her to address him as master. He created elaborate rules and protocols that governed every aspect of her existence. She had to ask permission to speak. She had to keep her eyes downcast in his presence. She had to perform degrading acts on command. The purpose of these rules was not practical. It was psychological. Each act of submission reinforced her powerlessness. Each moment of obedience eroded her sense of self. What makes this case particularly disturbing is that Catherine's children were in the house during much of this abuse. Baker used them as leverage, threatening to harm them if Catherine resisted or tried to escape. He also began grooming the children, teaching them to view their mother's subjugation as normal, as deserved, as the natural order of things. He was not just torturing one person. He was attempting to create a household where slavery was accepted and normalized. Would you have tried to escape knowing your children might be harmed? Or would you have submitted to protect them? The psychological impact of prolonged captivity combined with the threat to her children created a state of learned helplessness in Catherine. She stopped thinking about escape. She stopped imagining a life beyond Baker's control. She accepted her status as a slave because accepting it was less painful than constantly fighting against an unchangeable reality. Baker reinforced this mindset through a combination of punishment and occasional reward. When Catherine obeyed perfectly, he would allow her small privileges: extra food, time out of the cage, brief moments of kindness. These rewards were unpredictable and arbitrary, which made them more powerful. Psychologists call this intermittent reinforcement, and it is one of the most effective tools for controlling behavior. When punishment is constant, people adapt and become numb. When reward is predictable, people take it for granted. But when both punishment and reward are unpredictable, people become hypervigilant, constantly trying to please, constantly afraid of making a mistake. Catherine's world contracted to the boundaries of Baker's house. She lost track of time. She lost connection to her previous identity. She became, in her own mind, exactly what Baker told her she was: a slave who existed only to serve him. The case broke open almost by accident. A neighbor who had not seen Catherine in months became concerned and called social services. When a caseworker visited the house, Baker allowed them inside, confident that Catherine was too broken to reveal what was happening. He was almost right. Catherine said nothing during the initial visit. But the caseworker noticed her demeanor, the way she flinched when Baker moved, the way she seemed terrified to speak. The caseworker returned with police. Even with police present, Catherine initially denied that anything was wrong. She had been so thoroughly conditioned that she protected her captor, insisted that she was fine, that she was there voluntarily. It took hours of gentle questioning before she finally broke down and revealed the truth. The investigation that followed documented nearly a year of systematic torture and psychological abuse. Police found the cage in the basement. They found implements of torture. They found detailed journals where Baker had recorded his methods and his philosophy of control. He had written extensively about his belief that some people were naturally meant to be slaves, that Catherine had been weak and therefore deserved her fate, that he was simply fulfilling the natural order. Edward Baker was arrested and charged with kidnapping, assault, and multiple counts of child endangerment. His trial revealed the full scope of his crimes and forced the legal system to grapple with questions about consent and coercion. Baker's defense argued that Catherine had stayed voluntarily, that she could have left at any time, that her continued presence in the house proved she had consented to the arrangement. This argument reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of coercive control. Catherine could not leave because Baker had systematically destroyed her ability to conceive of leaving. He had isolated her from support systems. He had made her financially dependent. He had threatened her children. He had broken down her sense of self until she no longer believed she had the right or ability to make decisions about her own life. The prosecution brought in expert witnesses to explain the psychology of captivity and coercive control. They described learned helplessness, trauma bonding, and the ways prolonged abuse reshapes the brain. They explained that Catherine's compliance was not consent, but rather a survival strategy, a way of enduring an unbearable situation. The jury convicted Baker on all counts. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Catherine was freed, but freedom did not mean recovery. She had to rebuild her entire sense of self. She had to learn to make decisions again, to trust her own judgment, to believe that she had value as a human being. Her children required extensive therapy to process what they had witnessed and to unlearn the lessons Baker had taught them about power and submission. The case of Edward Baker demonstrates how captivity can exist without physical restraints. Catherine was not chained. The doors were not locked. She could have walked out at any time. But psychological chains are often stronger than physical ones. When someone controls your understanding of reality, when they make you believe that resistance is impossible and escape is futile, they do not need locks or chains. Your own mind becomes the prison. This case also highlights the vulnerability of people in domestic situations. Catherine was not abducted by a stranger. She was gradually enslaved by someone she knew, someone she had trusted, someone who had access to her life and her children. This makes prevention incredibly difficult. How do you protect people from someone they have already let into their lives? How do you identify coercive control before it progresses to captivity? There are warning signs: isolation from friends and family, increasing control over daily activities, escalating verbal abuse, financial dependence, threats involving children. But these signs are often visible only in retrospect. While they are happening, they can seem like normal relationship conflicts, like someone being protective or concerned rather than controlling. The case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power and vulnerability. We like to believe that slavery is a historical phenomenon, something that ended with the Civil War and exists now only in distant countries with weak legal systems. But Edward Baker proved that slavery can exist anywhere, that it requires only one person willing to dominate and another person vulnerable enough to be dominated. Catherine's survival and eventual escape demonstrate that even the most thorough psychological conditioning can be broken, that the human spirit retains some capacity for resistance even in the most oppressive circumstances. But her ongoing struggle with trauma also demonstrates that survival is not the same as healing, that the psychological wounds of captivity can last far longer than the physical ones. In June 1992, Child Protective Services in St. Louis received an anonymous tip about children living in deplorable conditions. When caseworkers arrived at the address, they found a situation that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. 3 children, ages 4, 6, and 8, were living in a small closet in a basement apartment. They had been confined there for most of their lives, emerging only for brief periods when their mother needed them for specific purposes. They could barely speak. They did not understand basic concepts like day and night. They had been so thoroughly isolated from normal human development that psychologists initially questioned whether they could ever recover. Comment below. What do you think happens to a child's mind when they grow up in complete isolation? Barbara Atkinson was 34 years old, unemployed, and struggling with untreated mental illness and substance abuse. She had 3 children from different fathers, none of whom were involved in their lives. She lived in a basement apartment in a deteriorating neighborhood where neighbors had learned not to ask questions. She had convinced herself that keeping her children confined was not abuse but protection, that the world outside was too dangerous, that she was keeping them safe. This rationalization is common among parents who severely neglect or abuse their children. They construct elaborate justifications that allow them to view their actions as necessary or even loving. Barbara told herself that the closet was temporary, that she would let the children out when circumstances improved, that she was doing the best she could under difficult circumstances. These justifications allowed her to continue the abuse without confronting the reality of what she was doing. The children had been confined to the closet since infancy. It was a space approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep, with no windows and minimal ventilation. They slept on a thin mattress on the floor. They had no toys, no books, no stimulation of any kind. Barbara would open the door several times a day to give them food and water, to allow them to use a bucket that served as a toilet, and occasionally to bring them out for brief periods. The psychological impact of this confinement was catastrophic. Human children require social interaction, sensory stimulation, and physical movement to develop normally. Without these inputs, the brain does not form the neural connections necessary for language, emotional regulation, or social understanding. The children in Barbara's closet were being deprived of the basic experiences that create a functional human mind. When caseworkers first encountered the children, they were shocked by their condition. The children were severely malnourished, their growth stunted by inadequate nutrition. They had poor muscle tone from lack of physical activity. Their skin was pale from absence of sunlight. But the physical neglect was only the most visible aspect of the abuse. The children could barely communicate. They had developed a rudimentary language among themselves, a system of sounds and gestures that allowed basic communication but bore little resemblance to English. They did not understand questions. They did not make eye contact. They showed no curiosity about their surroundings. They had been so thoroughly deprived of normal human interaction that they had not developed the cognitive frameworks that most people take for granted. Psychologists who evaluated the children described them as functioning at a level far below their chronological age. The 8-year-old had the cognitive abilities of a toddler. The 6-year-old could not speak in sentences. The 4-year-old showed signs of severe developmental delay. All three exhibited behaviors associated with extreme neglect: rocking, headbanging, self-soothing behaviors that suggested profound psychological distress. What makes this case particularly tragic is that the damage was entirely preventable. These children were not born with disabilities. They were not genetically predisposed to developmental delays. They were normal infants who were systematically deprived of the experiences necessary for normal development. Barbara Atkinson had taken 3 potentially healthy children and destroyed their chances for a normal life through years of deliberate neglect. The question that haunted investigators was why. Why would a mother confine her children to a closet? What possible motivation could justify such treatment? The answer, as it emerged through investigation and psychiatric evaluation, was complex. Barbara suffered from severe depression and paranoid delusions. She believed that the outside world was dangerous, that people were trying to harm her children, that keeping them hidden was the only way to protect them. She also struggled with substance abuse, using drugs and alcohol to cope with her mental illness, which further impaired her judgment and ability to care for her children. But mental illness alone does not explain the abuse. Millions of people struggle with depression, paranoia, and substance abuse without confining their children to closets. Barbara also exhibited a profound lack of empathy, an inability to recognize or respond to her children's suffering. When confronted with evidence of the harm she had caused, she showed no remorse, no recognition that she had done anything wrong. In her mind, she had been protecting them. This disconnect between action and consequence is characteristic of severe personality disorders. Barbara could not or would not acknowledge that her children were suffering because doing so would require confronting the reality of her own actions. It was psychologically easier to maintain the delusion that she was a protective mother than to accept that she was an abuser. The children were removed from Barbara's custody and placed in foster care. The process of rehabilitation was long and uncertain. Psychologists were not sure how much recovery was possible. The children had missed critical developmental windows, periods when the brain is particularly receptive to learning language, social skills, and emotional regulation. Could they catch up? Or had the damage become permanent? The answer varied for each child. The youngest, who had spent less time in confinement, showed the most improvement. With intensive therapy, special education, and a stable foster placement, this child gradually learned to speak, to interact with others, to function in a relatively normal way. The progress was slow and required years of dedicated intervention, but it demonstrated that even severe neglect can be partially overcome with appropriate support. The older children faced greater challenges. The 8-year-old, who had spent nearly their entire life in the closet, struggled to acquire language and social skills. This child made progress but continued to function well below age level even after years of intervention. The 6-year-old fell somewhere in between, showing significant improvement in some areas while continuing to struggle in others. All 3 children exhibited lasting psychological effects from their confinement. They struggled with anxiety, particularly in enclosed spaces. They had difficulty forming attachments to caregivers. They showed signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. The early years of deprivation had left scars that would likely never fully heal. Barbara Atkinson was charged with 3 counts of child abuse and neglect. Her trial became an examination of the intersection between mental illness and criminal responsibility. The defense argued that her psychiatric conditions had impaired her ability to understand that her actions were wrong, that she genuinely believed she was protecting her children. The prosecution argued that regardless of her mental state, she had caused profound harm and needed to be held accountable. The jury convicted her on all counts. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison and permanently lost custody of her children. The sentence reflected society's judgment that even mental illness does not excuse the systematic abuse of children, that parents have a fundamental responsibility to provide basic care regardless of their own struggles. But the legal resolution did not address the deeper questions the case raised. How does a situation like this develop without intervention? The children had been confined for years. Barbara had contact with social services, with landlords, with neighbors. How did no one notice? How did no one intervene? The answer reveals systemic failures in child protection. Barbara had learned to hide the children when anyone visited. She had moved frequently, avoiding sustained contact with any one set of neighbors or service providers. She had fallen through the cracks of an overburdened system that lacked the resources to follow up on every concerning situation. The children had never been enrolled in school, never seen by doctors, never brought to the attention of authorities until the anonymous tip finally prompted investigation. This case demonstrates how child abuse can remain hidden even in plain sight. Barbara was not living in isolation. She was in an apartment building with neighbors on all sides. But poverty, mental illness, and social dysfunction create a kind of invisibility. People in struggling neighborhoods often have their own problems, their own reasons to avoid contact with authorities. The children's silence, enforced by years of confinement, meant they could not cry out for help, even if they had understood that help was possible. The case of the closet children forces us to confront the vulnerability of children who depend entirely on their parents for survival and development. Unlike adults who can seek help or escape abusive situations, children are completely powerless. They cannot leave. They cannot report abuse. They cannot even understand that their situation is abnormal if they have never experienced anything else. The 3 children in Barbara Atkinson's closet spent their early years in a state of profound deprivation, their minds and bodies stunted by lack of care. Their eventual rescue came too late to prevent lasting damage, but early enough that some recovery was possible. They survived, but they will spend the rest of their lives coping with the consequences of those years in darkness. On August 26, 2009, Philip Garrido walked onto the campus of the University of California, Berkeley, with 2 young girls, seeking permission to hold a religious event. His behavior was erratic enough that campus security became suspicious and ran a background check. They discovered he was a registered sex offender who was not supposed to have contact with minors. When police questioned him, he revealed a secret he had kept for 18 years. He was holding a woman captive in his backyard, and the 2 girls were her daughters, born in captivity. The woman was Janice Jugard, who had been abducted at age 11 and had spent nearly 2 decades living in a hidden compound behind Garrido's house. Before we continue, leave a comment. How do you think a child abducted at 11 would understand the world after 18 years of captivity? On June 10, 1991, 11-year-old Janice Jugard was walking to her school bus stop in South Lake Tahoe, California. Her stepfather watched her walk up the hill, then turned away for a moment. When he looked back, Janice was gone. A witness reported seeing a gray sedan pull up beside the girl, seeing someone grab her and pull her inside, seeing the car speed away. Despite an extensive search and investigation, Janice disappeared without a trace. Philip Garrido had abducted her. He was a 40-year-old convicted sex offender on parole for a previous kidnapping and rape. He had spent 11 years in federal prison and was supposed to be under supervision. He lived with his wife Nancy in Antioch, California, about 3 hours from where Janice was taken. He had been planning another abduction for months, driving around looking for a suitable victim, someone young and vulnerable, someone he could control. Garrido took Janice to his house and imprisoned her in a hidden area behind his property. He had constructed a series of sheds and tents surrounded by trees and fencing, creating a compound that was invisible from the street and from neighboring properties. He soundproofed the structures. He installed locks and alarms. He created a prison that would hold Janice for the next 18 years. The first years of Janice's captivity were characterized by complete isolation and systematic abuse. Garrido kept her locked in a shed, allowing her out only when he wanted to assault her. He told her that her family had stopped looking for her, that no one cared, that she belonged to him now. He was not just imprisoning her body. He was working to imprison her mind, to make her believe that escape was impossible and that her previous life was gone forever. Janice was 11 years old. She had no framework for understanding what was happening to her. She had been ripped from a normal childhood and thrust into a nightmare that made no sense. Her mind, still developing, adapted to captivity in ways that would shape her psychology for the rest of her life. Garrido's wife Nancy was complicit in the captivity. She helped guard Janice. She participated in the abuse. She enabled her husband's crimes through active participation and willful blindness. Like Janice Hooker in the Cameron Hooker case, Nancy Garrido was both a victim of her husband's control and a perpetrator of crimes against another victim. She had her own history of abuse and dependence, but she made choices that facilitated Janice's suffering. As years passed, Garrido allowed Janice increasing freedom within the compound. She could move between the sheds and tents. She could spend time outside in the hidden yard, but she could not leave. The compound was surrounded by fencing and monitored by Garrido. Even if she had tried to escape, she had nowhere to go. She had no money, no identification, no knowledge of the area. She had been 11 when she was taken. She was now a teenager, then a young adult, with no experience of the world beyond captivity. When Janice was 14, she became pregnant. She gave birth to her first daughter in the backyard compound with no medical care, only Nancy Garrido assisting. The baby was healthy by chance rather than design. Janice was now not just a captive but a mother, and this changed the psychological dynamics of her imprisonment. Children create both additional vulnerability and additional motivation. Garrido now had more leverage over Janice. If she tried to escape, she would have to take her daughter with her, making escape more difficult. If she resisted, he could threaten the child. But motherhood also gave Janice a reason to survive, a purpose beyond mere endurance. 3 years later, Janice gave birth to a second daughter. Both children grew up in the compound, knowing no other life. Garrido homeschooled them, teaching them his bizarre religious philosophy and keeping them isolated from the outside world. The girls believed Garrido was their father and that their living situation was normal. They had no basis for comparison, no understanding that other children lived differently. This multi-generational captivity created a closed system where abnormality became normal. The children did not know they were prisoners because they had never experienced freedom. Janice could not tell them the truth without risking their safety and her own. The compound became its own reality, with its own rules and logic, disconnected from the world beyond the fences. What makes this case particularly disturbing is that Garrido was under parole supervision throughout Janice's captivity. Parole officers visited his house regularly. They checked on his compliance with sex offender registration requirements. They were supposed to ensure he was not reoffending. Yet for 18 years they never discovered the compound in his backyard, never found the woman and children he was holding captive. This represents a catastrophic failure of the criminal justice system. Garrido was a known sex offender with a history of kidnapping and rape. He was supposed to be monitored closely. Yet the monitoring was superficial, focused on paperwork and brief visits rather than thorough investigation. Parole officers never searched the backyard. They never questioned why Garrido had constructed so many structures on his property. They never noticed the signs that should have prompted deeper scrutiny. The case finally broke open because of Garrido's own erratic behavior. In 2009, he began taking Janice and her daughters out in public, convinced that his religious delusions would protect him. When he appeared at UC Berkeley with the two girls, his behavior was strange enough to prompt investigation. When police questioned him, he initially tried to lie, but eventually the truth emerged. The discovery of Janice Jugard shocked the nation. She had been missing for 18 years. Her case had gone cold. Her family had never stopped searching, but had little hope of finding her alive. Now she was found, but she was no longer the 11-year-old girl who had been taken. She was a 29-year-old woman who had spent more than half her life in captivity, who had given birth to 2 children in a backyard compound, who had been so thoroughly isolated that she struggled to interact with the outside world. Philip and Nancy Garrido were arrested and charged with kidnapping, rape, and false imprisonment. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Janice's testimony, the physical evidence of the compound, the DNA evidence linking Garrido to the children, all pointed to years of systematic abuse and captivity. Both Garridos pleaded guilty, avoiding a trial that would have forced Janice to relive her trauma in public. Philip Garrido was sentenced to 431 years in prison. Nancy Garrido received 36 years to life. The sentences reflected the severity of their crimes and ensured they would never be released. But the legal resolution did not address the deeper damage. Janice had to rebuild her entire life. She had to learn to function in a world she barely remembered. She had to help her daughters, who had grown up in captivity, adjust to normal life. She had to process 18 years of trauma while simultaneously trying to move forward. Janice has shown remarkable resilience. She has reconnected with her family. She has worked to provide her daughters with normal lives. She has written about her experience, helping others understand the psychology of long-term captivity. But she has also been honest about the ongoing challenges, the ways captivity continues to affect her even years after her release. The case of Janice Jugard raises profound questions about the nature of childhood development and identity formation. Janice was abducted at 11, an age when personality and worldview are still forming. She spent her teenage years and early adulthood in captivity. The person she became was shaped by that captivity in ways that cannot be undone. She survived, but she can never recover the childhood and adolescence that were stolen from her. The case also highlights the failure of systems designed to protect public safety. Philip Garrido was under supervision. He was being monitored. Yet he was able to hold a woman and 2 children captive for 18 years without detection. This failure has prompted reforms in how sex offenders are supervised, but it cannot undo the harm that resulted from the original failure. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that Janice's captivity could have been discovered at any point during those 18 years. A more thorough parole check, a neighbor who investigated strange sounds, a utility worker who noticed the compound, any of these could have led to her rescue years earlier, but it did not happen. She remained hidden, imprisoned, suffering, while the world went on around her, unaware that a woman and 2 children were living in captivity just beyond a fence. The case forces us to confront how much suffering can exist hidden in plain sight, how people can be imprisoned not in remote locations, but in suburban backyards, how the systems we create to protect the vulnerable can fail so completely. Janice Jugard survived 18 years of captivity and has worked to rebuild her life, but her survival came despite the system, not because of it. Her case stands as a reminder that vigilance and thorough investigation are not optional luxuries but essential requirements for protecting the most vulnerable members of society.